So we're going to talk in this final session about a procurement procedure called quick quotes. It's not something that's particularly new, but it is something that's maybe a little bit under the radar, and especially if you might be a little bit new to procurement as well. But the reason it's important is that it's very much something that favours suppliers if you're perhaps smaller or if perhaps you're just starting on the public procurement process and maybe not quite so geared up for some of the bigger frameworks or larger contracts. So the quick quote is part of the formal process of procurement, so it's very much embedded in the regulations, and it's something that every public body in Scotland can use as a way, if you like, to procure goods and services. It's probably, in a sense, not a huge amount different to the way that people used to invite quotes. And you'll see this in some of the public procurement websites in the olden days, pre-electronic. You know, people could go out and get 3 quotes. I suppose like we would as well, if you're getting your kitchen done or whatever. But this is very much an online system, and it's been developed, importantly, to be transparent, and it can be audited as well. And for us as suppliers, that's good. So it's not a quoting system where buyers can somehow have, I think in the past people had approved lists that you maybe didn't quite know how to get onto. So we're going to cover an overview of how this quick quote system works. So as I say, it's very much embedded in not just council procurement rules, but across the public sector. There are what we call thresholds. So any procurement, any purchase by a public body that is £50,000 in value or less comes into this quick quote category. There's a different threshold, as you might imagine, for works. So the 50,000 is for goods, supplies, and also services. So that captures quite a lot of the buying. But the works category would cover construction, civil engineering, particularly trades, perhaps, tends to be works rather than services as well. And that is interesting because that level is now up to 2 million. So you can start to see some really quite big contract opportunities that might, rather than being put out to an open published tender, it might go through this quick quotes route. In particular as well, the quick quotes, there is quite a strong onus now in public bodies to encourage small and medium-sized enterprise, third sector social enterprise involvement. And quick quotes is now really seen as quite a good preferred route for smaller businesses to get involved. I think the most important part of the quick quotes process is this first line here, where we note that it's by invitation only. So on Public Contract Scotland, on the portal, every day we'll get lots of contract notices coming out for tenders. Quick quotes won't be included in that. You won't see a list of all the quick quotes open at the moment. You'll only know if you've been invited to a quick quote if it comes through your email. And that's all administered by Public Contract Scotland, but it's absolutely crucial that you can't just log in, find a quick quote opportunity and somehow invite yourself. It's up to the buyer to decide who they want to invite. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. The other important part is that it's the Public Contract Scotland portal where all of the quick quotes process is administered. So from the buyer's point of view, and we'll have a look at this later as well, the buyers will log on to Public Contract Scotland, they'll set up their quick quote in the way that they might do for a tender, but at a certain point, they will then decide who to send the quick quote out to, and they're going to use Public Contract Scotland and our registrations, our supplier finder profiles, and they're going to use that largely to decide who to send the quote to and who to select. So registering on PCS, if you haven't done so already, is absolutely crucial. Can I just check who's on PCS already, hopefully? Nearly everybody? Thank you, Supplier Development Programme. If you haven't, it's super easy. You get onto the main website, there's either a login or a register facility, you register as a supplier, you'll end up with a few bits and pieces to fill in, but I have to say it's not particularly onerous. You might get asked, in particular, if you're a third sector organisation, so social enterprise, charity, not-for-profit. If you tick that box, that can be very interesting for a buyer to know that, but it's not going to either favour you or exclude you, so it's really just for information only. Other than that, generally the registration form at this stage for the company information or the organisation is very straightforward. Just be a little bit careful, and we'll probably mention this lots of times. You'll be asked for an email address, and that is the email address that all your quick quotes will be sent to. So, same as your general registration, absolutely crucial that you don't have Gill at Supplier Development Programme. If I'm on holiday, you'll miss it. If you register, somebody leaves your company, your quick quote might be sent to someone who doesn't even exist anymore. So keep it as tenders at, info at, inquiries at, and just make sure you've got at least a couple of people tracking those emails. When you go through the registration, if you're doing it for the first time, you'll do those basic forms for your company information. You'll then be asked for what we call the alert profile. We'll look at that shortly, but that's where you choose your keywords, the sort of categories, I think is the terminology. And you'll then go into your supplier finder profile. And once you've done that, it will then be available on what we call the suppliers area on PCS. So I'm assuming because lots of hands went up, quite a lot of you have probably gone through this process already. So if you want to go and check your supplier finder profile, you need to go onto the supplier area. And towards the left-hand side, you'll be able to see the company profile, the alert profile, and the supplier finder profile. So after today, it's a good idea to go and check, A, that your profile's filled in, but also just to make sure that it's as up to date as it possibly can be. So the company profile part, again, most of that you'll see through these forms that'll fill in automatically. The alert profile is interesting because this is where I mentioned before these categories. And if I'm a buyer looking on PCS to set up a quick quote, it could be that I decide to say, well, tell me everybody in category, whatever, building materials, digital media services, something like that. And I might use that as a way rather than a general search. So the way that you choose your categories can be quite important. But like any system of categories, sometimes it's a little bit tricky and you might not necessarily find your precise category there. I would encourage you probably just to use the search categories tab on here. Put in the keywords that you think you probably want to use and that would describe your business, and then see what comes up in terms of the actual categories available to you. The other thing that I do quite commonly as well is I'll track through maybe some tender contract notices on PCS in the area that I'm interested in. And part of the contract notice on PCS, there's a tab called, I think it's called codes, can't quite remember, I'm sure it is. But there you'll see what the buyers selected as their category. So that gives you a clue what they've maybe chosen as well. Be a little bit aware, the categories tend to be in a bit of a tree arrangement. So going back to maybe some of like, say, construction works is the top of the tree, and then it might go down the categories. So I tend to choose quite a lot of them. I'll choose the main level, which means you might get lots of notices through, but it's a kind of fail-safe to make sure that you get spotted in a list. It's a good question to ask, by the way, of some of the buyers here as well. How do they go through and use this categories type arrangement? Okay, so that's the alert profile. You can, by the way, go in and change your alerts at any point. So if you find you're getting far too many, you can maybe take some categories out. If you find some new categories, you can add them in very easily as well. So coming on to what we would call the supplier finder profile proper, the very important part is the button at the top. So it'll be sitting defaulting to unpublished when you start. But as you're filling everything in, you tend to move down the screen and you might quite easily forget to go back up and press publish. If you don't press publish, you're basically invisible. So a buyer doing a search, even though you filled everything in, isn't actually going to see your profile. So that's another good thing to check when you log back into PCS and make sure that you're actually hit that button. The first part is generally just again the contact information. The second part, you're allowed to select the regions where you work. So depending on the type of services, I guess we're a kind of consultancy training organisation. We'll work across everywhere in Scotland, so we've selected all the categories. But it might be you're doing something like, I don't know, delivering maybe sort of healthcare type services, but it's very localised. And at that point, you might want to just select the areas that you work in. And then the other part on the right-hand side is this opportunity to put in 6 keywords. When we see one of the profiles published, you'll see that it's actually the keywords is the main part that the buyer sees when they start to trawl through these entries. So getting your keywords right, again, is absolutely critical. I've looked through PCS as suppliers. You don't have access to the database, but as a buyer, you do. But just for our training, going through some of the entries, the keywords that some people have used are frankly useless. High value service, I don't know, like single words. So really try and think very carefully, if you were the buyer, what would you be using as your criteria to find the company that you're looking for? You can put in phrases, it doesn't have to be single words. And I think actually you can put some words with commas and add in a few more. So it's a little bit flexible, but make sure that you choose the keywords that are of interest to the buyer. And then the final part, and this is maybe the more difficult part, is to fill in the box for the company description. It's purely text only. You can barely do any formatting, so you can't include pictures or nice fonts or anything like that, but you do need to structure it in quite a strong way so that when the buyer's reading through, they can actually see the different areas that you're talking about. You get, I think it's around 4,000 characters, so easily half a page of text. You don't need to fill all of that, but you do need to do more, and I've seen loads of this, more than just a one-liner, because the buyer will go through and honestly, unless they actually know you, you'll probably be discarded. So a reasonable sized description is needed at this point. The most important thing, I think, is to be very clear about what the main either services, supplies, or works are that you're offering. The way that the profile appears when the buyer is searching, you get a teaser text, so you literally get just the first 2 lines and then read more. So already, even in that first line, you need to be able to say, we do X, Y, Z, and not necessarily, you know, here's the history, and slowly you work up to it. You can't particularly easily put in bullet points, but you can put in a sort of dash, so it is some sort of list rather than a big long text of what you do. I think looks a lot better. If you're an organisation that does 2 or 3 quite different things, that maybe, I don't know, something that appeals to NHS, and then a completely different service or goods that appeals to another type of organisation, it's not a problem to have 2 different profiles for those, and that might actually be clearer. But don't build up multiple profiles. Try and keep it to 1, ideally, if you can. So a nice clear explanation of what you're offering. No marketing speak, by the way, none of this. We're the unique, we're the vast experience, we're high quality, person centred. As neutral as you can be, just absolutely factual. Obviously, there's space limitations, but just for readability, it's not a website, it's not a brochure. Accreditations, if you have them. So that can be anything from the sort of ISO, it could be a sort of, I was thinking particularly in social care areas, you'll have quite standard things. It could be that it's a membership of a trade association. anything at all to do with that. Health and safety is another big area, CHAS, construction line, that type of thing. I've seen a few profiles where people have had awards or they've been nominated for awards, and that kind of maybe, I think, makes you stand out a bit if you're lucky enough to be able to say that. And then importantly, your experience. I would maybe put that a little bit higher up in this list. So if I'm a public sector buyer, I would like to know if you've already worked with the public sector. If you haven't, I'd still like to know what maybe commercial organisations you work for. Do you work with charities? Just to give me a feel, not your whole customer list, but if, I think particularly as a small company, if you can say, well, we look small, but guess what? We've worked with XYZ companies, or we're involved in a collaboration with other suppliers, that type of thing. So anything that shows that you punch above your weight, you're reliable, you can take on a contract, you've got capacity for that. And then to some extent, a sort of key sales message, but I would rather maybe just say if there's things that you can highlight perhaps that makes you either different or better, then try and say that, but again with evidence. Try not to just have your opinion, something that can back it up with either numbers. Another good thing as well I've seen is where people say, oh well, we can take on contracts between 2,000 and 100,000, some idea of your scale, your number of staff, things like that. But not, you have to try and keep it in the sense of, well, what's the benefit to the customer rather than a big deal, long history of your company. Okay, and again, you can change that description whenever you need to, and it's a good idea to go back to it and just make sure it's refreshed as well. This one, although it does start when they were established, but that was 2003, so you can already say, well, that's 20 plus years, so quite good to know. They've got a nice short description of their activities, and then they've got some bullet points on some of the examples of the clients that they've worked with. They've talked about to date, they've delivered 400 projects. They've also said that they work in Dumfries and Galloway and south of Scotland. So as a buyer, I already know, well, that's an interesting company, but if I'm based up in Aberdeen, then maybe that's not the ones for us. They've talked about investing in plant, which I think is good. They've also talked quite a bit about the staff, and I think that's, again, quite good because it gives an idea of scale. So they've got so many staff, they've got their CSCS cards, obviously for construction, that's important. And they've talked about their plant operators. So without making a very big detail, you start to get a good impression that this is a professional company. And they've talked as well about some qualified architectural technicians. So maybe that's a sort of specialism. Anything, again, that's a little bit different is worth to add in there. And then at the bottom, they've done the list of all the different accreditations that they've got. There's another couple of things that I would probably add now to the supplier finder profile that we wouldn't have recommended a few years ago. If you're living wage accredited, I would add that in. And anything that you're doing in relation to sustainability and environment. So if you're a member of the like the SME Climate Hub, for example, I'm trying to think of there's maybe fewer credentials, but you could have like ISO 14001, but anything at all that's kind of note to do with sustainability is definitely important. And community benefits, so just going back to the presentations earlier today, are you taking on apprentices? How much maybe volunteering hours, typically a year, your company puts in for community benefits? So try and quantify it if you can. And as I say, that's in comparison to literally even quite large companies I've seen, they've put in about 4 lines, usually a kind of mission statement of sorts. Absolutely useless. Okay, so setting yourself up, what happens then when the quick quote comes through? Obviously, just a reminder again about the email address issue, but at that point, it'll come through to the inbox. And just a word of warning, because I've fallen foul of that, we missed a quick quote opportunity from one of the councils, Falkirk Council, to quote for some consultancy procurement training or whatever. But when we saw it in the inbox, the notice looks very similar to the standard ones that you get, you know, just to say, here's our latest contract notices. So quite easy to miss. Luckily, we got a phone call from the council. And the other mistake we'd made was we hadn't chosen a certain category. And as a result, we didn't shoot. Initially, they thought they couldn't find us. So watch out as your emails come through. Watch out for these quick quotes. It will say it in the title, but it's sometimes not quite so obvious. Once the quick quote comes through, you will click on the opportunity as it comes in. You open it up, and it's, to be honest, it's just like opening up a normal contract notice. And at that point, there's a button on the screen where you can accept or decline. I would always accept and then check out the documents, and then you can go back and decline afterwards if it turns out it's not something you can quote for. And it then drops into your interest box on the PCS portal. And at that point, you're really, to all extents, operating as if it's a normal tender, contract notice and tender, except that it's limited to you and whoever else has been invited to quote, which you won't know, by the way. You've really no idea till the end of the process who else is involved. Okay, so that'll sit in your interest list, and at that point you'll go in, and everything at this point still stays within PCS and the post box. You'll get the normal, so a bit like the contract notice, you'll get a tab with Q&A. You'll be able to ask questions. You'll have a tab with the documents. So that's the first bit. I would open up, have a look at the quote. We've filled in some quotes which I have to say are as big as tenders sometimes, but in general you won't be asked necessarily for single procurement documents. Theoretically, they should be a lot more straightforward than a full tender. The other thing to be aware of is the deadline. So the deadlines can be very short, sometimes even as short as 2 weeks. Okay, when you open up your post box, again, any of you who've submitted tenders on PCS, it's exactly the same process. You've got your contact details drop in, and then on the right-hand side here, you're just uploading your documents. So all of your preparation would be exactly the same as for a normal tender. Just looking at how the buyer goes through this process, the buyers are all registered in PCS as well, but they are registered as a buyer, which gives them access to all the facilities to set up tenders and quick quotes. When it comes to the quick quotes, once they've put all their documents together, put in their deadlines, all of that information, they'll then click on a link which will take them to the supplier finder area, and they've got 3 options at this stage. The first option is the category search, which was the one I mentioned earlier. So that's where they'll run through, and we'll see shortly what that looks like to them. The supplier's details, if they've been to meet the buyer and they've got your card, for example, they can say, right, well, I remember Intend or whoever, let's have a look at them and see if we can find, and they can search for you by your name, the company name, I think maybe possibly keyword as well, can't remember the third one. And then the third one is the more general, what I would call the supplier finder search, and that's where they can do a search by keyword, by postcode, and combine lots of different areas, and that will throw up everybody who meets those criteria. So this is what the category output looks like. I think at this stage they will have selected some criteria, but when they click on it, they'll get a list, and on the left-hand side are all the companies who are registered under that category. However, it's A to Z. And some of them, if you put in, I'm just trying to think of a good category, but things like website design, there's going to be at least, I don't know, probably hundreds and hundreds now in a big long list, A to Z. So for the buyer, it's not particularly helpful. I think the buyers would only use this if it was maybe quite a specialist area, and at some point maybe they'd only get, I don't know, 10 or 20. But just to make you aware, that's A to Z output is how that happens. More likely then is that supplier finder. So On the left-hand side, they'll be filling in some search terms. This one's SDP, so it's gone in as the supplier's name. But there's an opportunity to do regions, keywords, and postcode. Click on search, and then there'll be a list of profiles, and this is what your profile looks like at first view. So the contact details at the top. Please put in a logo, otherwise you just get that grey, horrible silhouette. There's a link to your website, and there's a link to your full profile. But other than that, if the buyer's got 20 or so to look through, it's a little bit like Google effect. They'll start skimming through. So your keywords are absolutely crucial, and that first couple of lines of the teaser text as well. Okay, so really just to finish up, because it's by invitation only, it's absolutely critical that you obviously fill in your supplier finder profile, but you need to do a bit more of what I would call more traditional marketing to try and get yourself, particularly if you're keen on getting work from your local council, NHS. Remember, by the way, that it's not just these big organisations. There's 900 public buyers on PCS that could all be sending you quick quotes of business. What we would normally recommend is, aside from obviously meet the buyer events, take a look at some of the contract notices that are going out. There's something called Contracts Register on Public Contracts Scotland, and that's a list of contracts which have already been awarded. But the format to me is quite interesting because in the first part of the Contracts Register, you'll get the overview of the contract, and at the bottom, you'll get usually an email address of someone who's responsible within that public body. Whereas the contract notice, what you tend to get is procurement at, or maybe a more generic. By the time it hits the Contracts Register, it tends to be someone who's dealing with, I don't know, say it was fleet management or facilities management. So it can take a long time. It's a bit of a trawling through job. It's a good job for an intern or somebody in for some work experience. But do some contract notice searching, on the Contracts Register as well, and you can start to harvest the details. And provided there's not a tender actually open, there's no issues with contacting those individuals directly by email. But let them know you've done your homework. Make sure that you know what other frameworks or contracts are round about. But the appeal is, I found you in the Contracts Register, I'm on the Supplier Finder database, please consider our company for a quick quote. And in general, when the quick quotes go out, it's usually literally between very minimum 3, 5 companies. So you want to be on that list of 5. The other point to mention very quickly is some of the local authorities now, under the Community Wealth Building Initiative, have issued internal regulations, if you like, recommendations. So South Lanarkshire, Fife Council, and what they're saying is, if of that 5, where possible, we want to have 5 companies from South Lanarkshire, 5 SMEs. So if you're in Fife or Aberdeen, and that's again a question to the councils up here, how do they choose their 5, and do they have this kind of preferential approach? Which, if you're in the region, fantastic. If you're not, it might be a little bit of a barrier. Having said that, they would only choose those local companies if there were enough of them to satisfy the competition. And it's up to them. They can choose, I don't know, I haven't heard of maybe up to 10 or for quick quotes, but it's of that measure, so just to be aware of that. Okay, other than that, just keep a bit of spring cleaning on your profile. It might be worth, and this is something unfortunately as suppliers we can't do, so we don't know how many supplier finder profiles are sitting on PCS under our company name, because anyone obviously can register themselves and might have set one up. So you might want to contact the help desk on PCS and just double check and get rid of any extra profiles you don't want, and let them know of anyone who's registered who's left. It's not something, unfortunately, that we can do the housekeeping ourselves. Okay, so just a very quick final question. Has anyone had a quick quote through PCS so far, a request? Yeah, yeah, so one or two. Great. Happy to take questions or happy to stay on for a wee bit longer here if anyone wants, once everybody heads off.
So one of the questions that's being asked is, if you decide to tender, although you don't know who else is tendering, will you know that there are other tenderers?
I think at the tendering stage, it's probably difficult to know really, either through a tender or a quick quote. The only way that you might find out, unfortunately, more is towards the end where you get the feedback, if it's detailed enough. Some reports back, the Scotland Excel, if you're bidding for some of their frameworks, their reports are very detailed and will tell you, all the people who've bid. But I would say in general, no. I think there may be something coming along, Gillian, that's to do with partnering, isn't there? So if, for example, a tender comes out and you think, well, we maybe don't want to tender ourselves, but would like to partner with someone else, there is a facility in the pipeline where you'll be able to alert other companies to say we're interested. So STP will be sending out as soon as that hits. And it's the same for quick quotes. You won't know how many other people have been asked to quote.
I think though they do have to publish an award, do they not, Jill?
Yes. Yeah.
So generally in the award notice it will say how many. So it'll say there was 3 people or 4 people or whatever was in there. But you're relying on that buyer providing that information. So I'm just looking at the list of questions here. We've got another one here. How do I increase my chances of being asked a quick quote?
Speak to the buyers. I was speaking to someone at Police Scotland stand earlier today, and we were just talking about this whole issue of, how good Meet the Buyers are. And he said exactly that. He said, we buy everything from coffee cups to, the big policey type things. He said, but I meet people at these events that I had no idea they were on my doorstep. So I think it is very much the case of get your profile, but get, emailing people directly, do it in a targeted way, and ask them. The quick quotes is the clue because they're not published, we've got to ask people, please consider us, and obviously put a good profile up as well.
Okay, we've got another one on the app here that says, how do I know if a quick quote is worth pursuing for my business?
I think usually I would tend to look when you'll get the full documents out with the quick quote. The difficulty is because you don't know who else is bidding. There is a little bit of an issue sometimes. People feel that you're quote fodder. So somebody kind of knows who they want and they've just got another 2 or 3 people just to make up the numbers. I think my issue with that is because it's all transparent now and these things are audited externally, a public buyer would get into trouble at some point if it became evident that they kept putting out quotes and choosing one buyer all the time or issuing them to the same 4 or 5 all the time. And at the end of the day, they're scored. So it's a bit like a tender. You'll get a quality score of some sort, or it might be a price only, but it will be scored. And that's public record, so you would have access eventually.
I'm going to say the scoring methodology, is that published as part of the criteria and documents when they put it out for quick quote as well?
Yes, so you should get that. And if you don't, that's another reason I maybe not to go for it. So if it's not absolutely clear how it's going to be assessed, it is a mini tender. Yeah. There are certain situations we've quote for training and consultancy work and there's no budget given. And that's another reason you think, well, shall we go for this? How big is the sky sort of thing? And I've seen that we've got clients in the sort of digital creative area and there were quite a lot of quick quotes went out to create fantastic big pieces of work for peanuts, basically. And at that point, you would just go back. And usually if you decline the quote, you'd ask the reason why. And I'm just quite blunt, to be honest. Or you can do it through the Q. There's a Q&A as well. You could say, well, this budget doesn't appear to cover the specification or so.
We've got one more here. Just talking a bit about the common mistakes suppliers make when competing quick quote. I mean, I suppose you've covered off quite a few of them, Joe, but
For common mistakes.
yeah.
Yes. I think probably, I mean, it's the same as the tenders as well, really. You have to be aware, particularly if things are scored. There might be a danger in the quick quote that you think it's a little bit casual, that you don't sort of give a full response to that. But I know certainly some of the quick quotes we've put in, it's almost as much work as a small tender, to be frank. So that could be an issue. Um, you still have to research your client a bit as well. So your responses need to be not just a cut and paste from another tender. A very common mistake, just there's nothing there that the buyer reads that says, oh, they know what we're talking about or what we're looking for. So it's still a competition at the end of the day. What else have we seen? Oh, just the usual spelling mistakes, cut and paste mistakes, things like that. Not answering the questions properly or fully. Saying, here's my answer to question one, and just missing out question two and referring back. So you have to sort of be quite clinical still about the way you fill in quick quotes and tenders. I usually advise people to fill in what they can and then give it to someone else who's not involved. And they might see things. If you've been sitting looking at it for quite some time, they'll sort of find the bleeding obvious, as they say, something that's been missed or, something that just doesn't sounds okay to you, but, people don't actually know what you're talking about. What's my favourite one? I hate we've got vast experience. It's like, to me, if I don't want opinions, I want evidence. So, what does vast experience mean? What does a high quality performance or high quality job, what does that mean to me as a client in terms of actual benefits as well?
How you doing? We're a construction company, and what we're finding is that a lot of local authorities don't know that we're out there. It's trying to get put in front of them. So, as you said, sometimes you might send in an email, and it just doesn't get to the right department, the right person to know what you are, and someone to do a bit of research on you and try and get on their quick quotes. So, how do we get that to that person probably in all the local authorities around the areas?
One of the things that we've seen happen, and it's been quite successful in some regions, is that either the business gateway or the economic development team in whichever council you're in, it's in their interest to make sure that your business grows and whatever, and they can sometimes do a one-to-one introduction or at least find you the right person to speak to. I've seen it, particularly the Ayrshires are very good at this. So every time a procurement is coming up, I think they did one recently for transportation for schools, another one for vehicle repairs, and the procurement team went back to the economic development team and said, particularly it was the vehicle repairs, and said, right, can you please make sure that all your companies know, but give us a list of the local, like little garages, people that they maybe didn't know necessarily. So I think if you go onto the Supplier Development Programme website, the SDP representative for each of the local authority areas is listed there, and they tend to be economic development. So I would definitely get in touch with them. Occasionally, I can't remember, there are, in the procurement teams, you'll usually find someone that's construction related. I know Aberdeen City certainly, and it'll be the combined one now, had a very construction focused team. You can also do that one, I suggest, the contracts register. So find some contracts that have been awarded in your area and look in the detail there for someone. And the final one that I've seen, but again, I'm not so sure if it's done up here, but in Fife Council, they run a beauty parade every couple of months, I think. And it's the Fife Building Services, and the sole purpose of that is for people to come along, usually to present something that's maybe a bit different or new products or techniques, but it might be worth asking if they have that kind of show and tell type events going on as well. Yes.
Just to add to that, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we host and deliver days like this, because it gives you that opportunity to go to the stand and speak to those people. The other thing I would recommend as well is you probably registered with the Supplier Development Programme for this event, but we often work with not just the councils but other public bodies. And if they're looking for contractors for particular events, we will then send out mailings to our database. So make sure you're on our database, that you've selected to get our newsletter so that you're informed of things that are coming up. You'll probably see at the moment we've got about 5 or 6 bespoke events that are for different areas in construction and other areas. And we're about to run a dynamic purchasing system for Scottish Government. So it's really important to keep ahead of what's happening there. We do get approaches from a lot of the contractors as well as the public sector saying we are looking for suppliers in a particular area to fulfil this contract. So another conduit for you to be keeping in touch with what's happening as well.
There have been quite a few Meet the Buyer events that STP have organised specifically with like Babcock's, Morrison's. There was a really good one in Falkirk, and there's going to be a big development outside Falkirk on the outskirts. And Babcock were there specifically to get all the construction related and tradespeople down, and all of that was organised through STP as well. So it wasn't a general Meet the Buyer, it was very specifically for that opportunity. So.